Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you. Fantastic. Good. I just want to say how much I enjoy the music and just the message of the music and how thankful I am to everybody for being here today. And thanks to Jean, thanks to Gigi, and Mary and Bob. I'd like to thank the Scituate Historical Society for hosting and promoting today's event. And the Eire Society of Boston equally for sponsoring this occasion and for encouraging our work on Patrick Curious. So 2.5 years ago, we asked the Eire Society for advice about an audio volume in the Scituate Historical Society Archives that had escaped attention for many years. How the item turned up in Scituate in the first place, nobody ever knows, but a lecturer from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, H. Lyons, contacted Mary about it in 2021. The volume had been mentioned briefly by the scholar Pádraig de Brún in his 1988 Guide to Irish Manuscripts at Treorchista. De Brún may have known more than we can now tell. In 1987, Boston Pilot senior editor and Eire Society gold medalist George E. Ryan written a fascinating article in the Boston Irish News entitled The Mysterious Book of Patrick O'Keeffe. Then, in 2005, Grandma Buala, a leading light in Irish studies, made inquiries and received images of the book from Carol Miles, who was archivist for the Scituate Historical Society during that time. O'Buala later visited Scituate to see the item itself, but he passed away in 2010 before he could write about it. Patrick, or Pat, O'Keeffe's book, as it is called by those who compiled it, is a 21.5 by 14 by 1.5 centimeter volume, about the size of a diary. As a personal book, it is more than a diary, as is shown by its contents. But first, as my interest in its measurements indicate, along with how, when, where, or with whom it turned up, one of the very first things to let an old book tell you before discovering more about it is its physical makeup. Now I just need to press OK here. Now there's a nice diagram for you. I'll pause slightly to say that you'll be in good luck if you have a napkin, because I really want to go back to elementary school here and say that a fundamental distinction has to be made when you're talking about books between what is a leaf and what is a page. So if you had a sheet and you folded it in half, then you have 2 leaves, right? And then each leaf has a page on each side. We call them manuscripts. We call it recto, which is the side, and verso, which is that side. So I have to remind myself of that a lot. So that brief digression. So the O'Keeffe volume is completely handwritten on what would perhaps originally have been 46 leaves or 92 unnumbered pages. Those 7 leaves have been torn away, and it looks like Patrick himself wrote nearly all of it, or it was written for him, although several parts were clearly written by or for a Michael or Mick Keefe, who, as we will see, could conceivably have been Patrick's son. Both of these scribes appear to autograph their own individual statements in the book. The 46 leaves amounted to 23 sheets, maybe originally 24, even numbers are nice, with a single sheet removed, folded in half and sewn down the center with a single thread to a thin, weathered leather cover, which is reinforced outside the back with another small leather strip. That cover, stamped with a swirl pattern, has turn-ins, which allow you, as you can see here, that would allow you to protect the pages. So the durable but soiled and sometimes pest-damage-laden paper was manufactured by Curtis and Sons. You can see in a second here. There. Just press the go button again. Should come up on. Let me see if I switch back. There we go. By Curtis and Sons, which you can see there from Surrey in England. It can't be earlier than 1791. The watermark you see here was made by ornamentally twisting wires like the vertical and horizontal ones. The marks, which are also available, are visible, I should say, on these images. Those will define a decollage, as they call it, or a screen, which holds a slurry of wet cotton fiber, which would eventually be put out to dry as paper. Who bought this paper and how it came to Ireland, I have no idea. It's faintly ruled in pencil throughout. You can see here, the writing on it is in ink, except for a few pencil jottings. So this is a manuscript, not a printed book. And although several kinds of evidence may be at play, we have none of the clues that arise from the technology for producing text, which printing involves. The next thing that strikes you is that although a fair amount of the handwriting in this manuscript is in English, using cursive script and showing local dialect, there's some of the local dialect for you. A great deal of it is also in the Irish language. Again, this is with the author's dialect peeking through, as you can see. And it uses the kind of script through which Irish was written for well over 1,400 years. As it turns out, the item we have is 200 years old, but the tradition it belongs to is much, much older. See, they're just looking at this is the same kind of script that was used to compile Columbus' Psalter, talking back, just previous to 600 AD. So that's continuity for you.
Well, I agree, swipe speaking to my
Yeah. Can you hear me now? A little better? Thanks, Tom. Thanks for waiting. The earliest date recorded for any of the several parts of our manuscript is 1815. The latest is 1855. Apart from statements that give dates, it's difficult to tell in what order the contents of this book were written or included in a group of related leaves or sheets, even though it looks like there's an overall rhyme and reason to the arrangement of its main entries. And these are written in a fair hand and set out with bold headers, ornamental and sometimes illustrated capitals and dividers. So this kind of logic even seems to include the places at which the 7 leaves have been removed. But what a strange layout it is. The beginning and the end of the book, which contain the oldest dates and are right next to bits of folklore, contrast sharply with the nicely laid out text. In fact, as you can see, they're a complete mess. Although texts oriented from the bottom of the page to the top or transversely from the outside in or vice versa occur at several points in the volume, at the very beginning and end, the written entries are jumbled very haphazardly, at least from the present vantage point. All the same, taking into account the missing leaves, it might be useful to think of what we have as being put together a little like an old sandwich. It's a moldy bread on the 2 outside parts is early stuff. In this case, chaotically arranged, but as we will see, strangely informative. And then come the other layers, condiments, tomato, cheese, and lunch meat, which are personal comments, folklore, literature, and calendrical reckonings. Here are some further images. Near the beginning and end of the book, Patrick O'Keefe names some of his associates, a Daniel Lane of Johnstown and a Patrick Letty, interestingly enough, are included at both ends of the manuscript, so that's your 2 pieces of moldy bread. O'Keefe also mentions Fermoy, as well as the aforementioned Johnstown, which may be Johnstown East in the civil parish of Dunmanton, or alternatively, Johnstown further north, close to Mitchellstown in the civil parish of Kildoran, barony of Condons and Clangibbon. The beginning of the book indicates O'Keefe's presence in Glanmire, close to Queenstown, now Cove, along with blank lines meant to be filled in and alluding to a passage as well as to a Captain Leahy, but not to any named ship. This page presents itself as a kind of title page, really, and there's an indication here again, as we just saw, that the book was lent out to acquaintances who might be interested in some of its contents. Pat Keefe, his book, dated June the 21st, 1815, wrote by Michael Keefe, County of Cork, borrowing of Domo Mahuna. Some jottings at the outset and at the conclusion account for purchases of foodstuffs, liquor, or perhaps ingredients for poutine, now and then with a view to special occasions, a wedding, a feast day, St. Patrick's Day, or a bowling Sunday. And it's anyone's guess whether or not the penance with a rosary to be said every night for the course of 2 weeks has anything to do with these celebrations. Throughout some of these notes, near the end of the book, are detailed lists naming both Mick and, quote, father, amidst business transactions, and tallies of shoemakers' materials and expenses, nails, steel, washers, pens, soles, trimmings, mendings, and removes, and even mention of using a horse to give a load of turf. Finally, there are pithy bits of wisdom, often in rhyme, with Patrick O'Keefe's self-deprecating comments and apologies for possible defects in writing English or in composition of his book, as we will see later. Other than pieces of, oops, here we go, but thanks a lot. Yeah, there we go. Other than pieces of folklore at the end of the book, the final third of it is almost completely taken up with calendrical calculations and tables following a traditional method of predicting the date of Easter with frequent instructions. There was an earlier one, so there you go. There's no absolute division of this material from other lore. In fact, the two are interrelated, since near the end of this section comes a synopsis with a southern perspective of the Book of the Taking of Ireland, a very famous story. The Eire, a biblically synchronized, part mythological and part classical account of the various peoples who came to form the land of Ireland up to the time of its first historical kings. In other words, for O'Keefe, one very big aspect of understanding where you exist in time depends on Easter, but another depends on knowledge of the ancient mythology and political history of Ireland. This helps the reader to get a sense of how and why O'Keefe or the O'Keefes put together what we will see in the first two-thirds of the volume. Before getting to that, I'd like to reiterate that the 7 leaves which were torn out of the O'Keefe manuscript are missing at very significant places. Mainly the divisions of the early and late bits of folklore I mentioned a while ago, or at the separation of these from leaves containing personal notes. At the transition between the first two-thirds of the book and the calendrical section comes another loss of 2 leaves. But right after this we read Boston, February 20th, 1847. Boston, alas, but old Eire, and then something that isn't yet intelligible to me. And then June 30th, 1847, Pat Keefe, his age at this time, 54 years, June 27th, 1847. This mention of Boston might only be a whimsical comment, or it might be something more. Whichever way, it is a record by Patrick O'Keefe of his possible presence, or at least interest in Boston at a specific date, giving his age as 54 and indicating that he was born in 1792 or 1793. 4 leaves later comes a marginal inscription which may indicate a date earlier than 1847. Here, Boston and Fermoy are mentioned together with subtraction of the year 1816 from that of 1846 for a remainder of 30. This calculation comes up again on the succeeding leaf. So wasn't O'Keefe really here in the Boston area at the height of the Great Famine? One thing that might tell against this strongly, or perhaps not, if folks actually travel back and forth, so to speak, is a record on the second to last leaf of the book, of this book, of the purchase of a cow at Glanworth's Fair near to Johnstown East in Fermoy, dated April 2, 1855. So again, overall, this last third of the O'Keefe book shows an obsession, really, with numbers and chronology. Woven into this are alphanumeric superstitions, perhaps self-oriented towards a man's possible family life. The first of those I'm showing you instructs the reader in Irish how to tell which of a married couple will be the first to die. Write the woman's and the man's proper names in Latin, add the numerical values of all the letters in their names using the superscribed table, and divide by 7. If the resulting number is even, the woman will die first. If not, the man. So as you can see, the second example on this slide in English concerns predicting the sex and longevity of a child. To find whether it is a male or female child that is in its mother's womb, write the father and mother's name and the month she conceived and the whole together and divide by 7. If even it is a daughter, if I don't know what about sons, but draw a son, to know whether the infant will live long or not, the father and the mother's name and the name of the day it will be born, add 25 to the number and divide by 7, even quickly, dying quickly, if odd long life. A third such attempt at prognostication is in English except for 2 pointed words, a way to know whether a woman be gamly, no drusial, chaste, or lascivious. First, write her own name and her mother's name and give their own number to every letter and add to the total number 15 and divide by 7. And if the end number be even, she is gamlich, and if odd, drusial. The first 2/3 of the O'Keeffe book, compiled mainly between 1815 and 1819, are very confidently laid out and are taken up with what we might call literature. What is included, however, constantly communicates an interest in the authority of renowned poets in religious or proverbial instruction or warning, tepask, and in a uniform and traditional view of Ireland's history in the face of oppression. The selections begin with the advice of the rustic poet to his pupil, a collection of proverbs which 200 years ago was a mainstay of the hedge school teachers who kept traditional Irish education alive during the era of penal laws. Some of these sayings are still known and even came up in the Irish language leaving cert exams a few decades ago. Na be croig is not be bog, na tre do chara do not be harsh, do not be soft, do not fail your friend for your part. Next comes a fragment of a praise poem to the chieftain Art Magarty, that is, to an early O'Keeffe, thought to be written by the 17th century Clare poet Tyke MacDonagh MacBroody, a well-known apologist for preeminence of the south of Ireland over the north. Then, the longest piece in Patrick O'Keeffe's book, which is known as John O'Connell's poem, was attributed to someone people eventually thought was a bishop from Eire. It is a rendering here in English of Irish history up to the time following Cromwell's depredation of the country, probably composed between 1655 and 59. This 92-verse work became very popular, not just in the hedge schools, but also among people of every occupation. There are well over 100 manuscripts which contain this poem, by the way. It was a kind of portable interpretation of Ireland's fortunes, and the version in O'Keeffe's book ends with an additional verse of benediction and exhortation to turn the scales in Ireland's favor. I mentioned respect for the authority of poets. This concern included the inverse approach, time-honored in Ireland, of disputing or satirizing learned people or others in authority who were political adversaries or who took the opposite side of any issue. O'Keeffe poses a clever bilingual rhyming problem to someone he names Angus Lev, foolish or insipid Angus O'Dolly. It looks like this is Anus Nanuir of Angus of the Satires O'Dolly, who lived 200 years before Pat O'Keeffe and played both sides of the Tudor conquest of Ireland, satirizing the Irish poets on behalf of Sir George Carew, President of Munster. This time warp is no trouble for O'Keeffe, and he proceeds with an equally barbed summons for O'Dolly to defend himself. The mock legal warrant, Barontas, to stand trial in the court of poetry levied at an opponent or poetic competitor is a literary conceit that emerged mainly in Munster during the penal laws of the 18th century, a time of much later than that of Angus. O'Keeffe's fluid association of confessional, patriotic, and poetic concerns continues through the next item, a poem by Sean Rua O'Shehon, or John Hyde, a person so far unidentified and undated. This is addressed to his former pupil, Dahi O'Mahona. So the name, I could say as an aside, Mahona just keeps coming up again and again as does O'Keeffe, and that's interesting insofar as any future research would go as far as locating this poem or the people that are mentioned. There's this book or the people that are mentioned in these ways in which he associates these names. So the poem begins, "Que guarda me em waistir, Gascoigne, although I was long the master of the men of Desmond." Again, we see Southern associations. Again, also, as with other literary works, the poem is laid out confidently with ornament at its beginning and end. O'Shehon censures, and it's a different name, Shehon from Shia, so this word it's anglicized as Hyde. He censures O'Mahona for abandoning the Catholic faith in favor of the Protestant temple or church, marrying an English or Protestant woman, Ban Alda, and using English law to bring about oppression. O'Shehon's plea for national and creedal unity compares O'Mahona's decisions with the deadly sin of gluttony, and levels at him the threatening prospects of mortality and a grim afterlife, contrasted with the reward for those like the author himself, who heed historical examples and obey the Pope. The next contribution, begun right after the central stitching, is a poem from 1684, the counsel of encouragement by a poor brother, that is, a Franciscan, to his fellow scholar. A version of Father William O'Hickey's admonishments to his friend Kian O'Mahona to take religious orders rather than marry a woman of high rank. This warning recalls how the great heroes of classical antiquity are now all in the grave. Its refrain is a reminder on the shortness of life. You yourself will not last long, but rather a miserable while. Following this comes a version of Oanrua Usuluan, Baronthus and Hata is the name of the poem, Warrant of the Hat, headed by a prologue in praise of Usuluan. Usuluan was a learned, and I can't resist giving the popular etymology of the name, because that's how the scribes used to just abbreviate. You didn't have to write your name if you were Sullivan. All you did was put an O in front of a picture of an I, because it's O, Su, that's your I, a Y, so only one I, and which was, I guess, in Irish tradition, if you had any kind of deformity, that meant you were inspired, you were a poet. Something strange. So that's his name. Usuluan was a learned Munster poet, a renowned Jacobite, a supporter of failing Stuart efforts to reclaim the throne, and he was beloved as a rakish character. His stolen hat with powers that could coax heroines from Irish classical mythology is used as a symbol for his amorous and poetic achievements, which were illegitimately credited to another. And it was used also as a device to introduce significant places of poetic assembly in south of Ireland throughout this poem. The feature of Patrick O'Keeffe's book I find personally most engaging is his love of the pious or witty saying, modest disclaimer, and marginal comment. Here are a few examples. At the beginning of Leaf 4, after a series of ones and zeros, possibly a binary code, comes the rhyme from numbers and art, never will I fairly depart. At the verso of Leaf 7 is a dated quatrain in Irish and English concerning loan of the book. At Leaf 20, commenting on the benediction concluding John O'Connell's poem, as we already saw, where it was a prayer, I do implore the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost that pardon for our sins we may obtain. Amen. On the back of Leaf 26, kinsmen, if you be poor, be sure no free freedom make, for you are a fool, though sure and wise you spoke. But if you be rich and spring from the race of clowns, your actions are good, and words of high renown. Spare not to spend too much, be this your care. Spare but to spend, and only spend to spare. For he that spends too much may want and so complain that he spends best and spares to spend again. There'll be a quiz on that. An Irish version of the second half of the verse follows this. At the beginning of leaf 27, all ye courteous readers of Hume Gath Glocht, who see every mistake, that I would speed the scrievens, though as written here. Excuse me, Marna bien puin gan locht, for nothing is without fault, and the vices unseen by me, deshik gan dosh, amen without fuss. At the front of leaf 30, noting O'Sullivan's clemency to the thief who took his hat, a good deed, for he merited more, the suffering rogue. At the front of leaf 37, written or wrote by me, i.e. Patrick O'Keefe of Johnstown, I so hereby request and pray the readers to excuse me for any vices or defects that is here unseen by lapse or oblivion, etc. On the final page, in telling fair shall you see this English plain I am scarce. In writing fair you plainly see I am degenerating, free, and no wonder indeed, for my fingers are cramped, I feel. June the 22nd, 1815. A fairly early date of the manuscript. At the foot of leaf 12, verso, at mention of the fate of the sons of Meal, traditional progenitor of the Irish, in John O'Connell's poem Agus Patrol Shin, and that was truly a pity. And on the preceding leaf, 12 recto, mention of matrimony, April 7, 1818, MJK, interesting enough. There are other incidental comments like the one you see here on Luther, across the possible indication of varying sources or scribes. So very personally involved with this book, with whatever he's writing. And here also are notes on the calends, crosses, initials, and special symbols, such as that on the back of leaf 39, which mark significant places in the text. Several of these are so far not deciphered. So considering the order and layout of content alone, if that's permissible in bibliographic work, a final question is why, like several of the earliest indications of the O'Keefe's profession, associates, and activities, does all of the material we might think of as folklore appear at the very beginning and end of this book? Before a loss of 2 leaves at the outset, the very first leaf of the manuscript contains a fragment of the adventure of the great fool, Achra an Amada and Woe, an Arthurian tale concerning the unpromising lad who becomes a virtuous and heroic knight, adapted to Irish and Scottish Gaelic in the late medieval and early modern times, which was widespread in oral and manuscript tradition. Then, on the last 2 leaves are some stanzas of an ashling or vision, the kind of poem of longing for freedom and rightful rule sung to an idealized woman representing Ireland, which has been very popular from the 17th and 18th centuries right up to the present. And finally, 7 quatrains of a poetic dialogue between Oisin and St. Patrick, versions of which are datable to the late 18th century, concluded by the aphorism, learning and manners are charming companions. Strangely enough, upside down on the earlier leaf where Patrick O'Keefe marks and dates his interest in Boston is the marginal note, Ossian to Oisin, son of Hume. And perhaps he's identifying himself as Patrick here. I don't know. It's a tempting thought. This quirky, bilingual 19th century personal volume might have come to Scituate at almost any time in any number of ways. The O'Keefe book looks like it arrived here previous to the development of Irish mossing during the American Civil War and expansion of the business by Daniel Ward of Coleraine. After this, Ward came to Scituate from Boston in 1847. But it is difficult to tell. How and when at all did the book come to New England? In the effort to identify the Patrick or Michael O'Keefe who may or may not have brought the book here, as well as other persons who are named in the manuscript, many friends, some of whom are here today, have given advice and help. Charlie Cook, who was thoroughly skilled in the with the genealogical resources at the Scituate Historical Society. John Colgan, Boston City archivist, now retired. And the Scituate resident emerita professor, Catherine Shannon, who was a widely recognized expert on famine-era Irish history and immigration. Among many sources, I've consulted the National Archives, Boston Archdiocesan Archives, Family Search, Massachusetts State Archives, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the New England Historic Genealogical Society and Irish Genealogy website. John Colgan has helped me toil through ship registers and listings of shoemakers in the Boston Directory. There is further work to do with names in the book, which appear to come from the north of County Cork, not to mention the possibility of additional scribal hands. On the North American side, nothing solid has come up. There is a curious Boston missing persons request regarding a Patrick O'Keefe, native of Glanmire, whatever native means here, who sailed from Liverpool to New York about 12 March 1846, corroborated by addresses for the petitioners who are shoemakers, but this does not come nearly close enough. One Patrick O'Keefe, however, is worth mentioning further as a more likely candidate for the dedicatee of our book, even if he is a failed one, as Charlie Cook has shown. Charlie found information concerning a Patrick Keefe of East Bridgewater, some 20 miles southwest of Scituate, who resided temporarily in Boston, whose certification of United States citizenship is dated October 26, 1855, and who claimed to have arrived in Boston on May 30th, 1847. He also turns out to have been 55 years old in 1855 and born on March 17th, 1800. His place of origin is said to be the townland and parish of Kilworth, Cork, a short distance east of Glanworth and north of Fermoy in the barony of Condons and Clangibbon. In the federal census for 1850, this Keefe, designated as a laborer, is already in East Bridgewater with his wife Catherine, who is 43, and his 7 children, who are spaced by 2 years each, ranging from 18 to 6. The 2 eldest, John and Michael, are listed as shoemakers. By the 1865 Massachusetts census, however, he adjusts his age to 73, while making no such augmentation for his wife. That's polite. She's 56. 73 is just the age our own Patrick O'Keefe would be in 1865, having been born in 1792. Whoever this person in East Bridgewater was, he was creative with numbers. In the 1870 federal census, he is back to age 70, and his wife is unengaged to 57. However, his signature of choice is uniformly an axe, which appears odd for a literate person. In 1865 and in 1870, for the second entry of which he is termed a farmhand, it is noted that he is able neither to read nor to write. His wife is indicated in 1870 as merely unable to write. And thank you very much again to Charlie for this amazing work. Catherine Shannon brought our attention to lists of Kilworth famine deaths in 1847, which were compiled for the local landlord, Lord Cashel, when he presented his case to Captain Forbes of the USS Jamestown in an effort to secure a portion of that ship's provisions to be sent to feed the starving community of his area. Included here are a David Keefe of Great Townland, a Peter Keefe of Ballinamooker with his 3 children, and an Arthur Keefe of Kilclaw with 1 child. It bears repeating that further information may result from pursuing personal names that occur in the O'Keefe manuscript, particularly those with a plausible origin in County Cork, or similarly from searching for local records, especially on the east coast of North America. A couple of final questions haunt us. When it was found, Patrick O'Keefe's book contained a clipping, a letter to the editor of the Boston Sunday Globe for December 22, 1878, written by a Boston Philo-Celtic Society member naming himself Eire, Little Hugh, pleading for study of the Irish language in the context of Ireland's antiquity and contribution to European education set against its calumniators and detractors.
If Patrick or Michael O'Keefe ever came to New England and lived long enough, was he or were they acquainted with Ithbjorn or with the society? There is certainly much left to be discovered in the O'Keefe book, including the origin and purpose of what appears to be an owner's or a seller's stamp of Harvey H. Small. Whether or not the book ever came to Boston, could it have simply made its way to New England, even particularly to Scituate, via an antiquarian, a book dealer, or another person not necessarily related to the O'Keefes who possessed some interest in the language, in the traditional history, and in the political fortunes of Ireland? Thanks to the efforts of Mary Porter and the Scituate Historical Society, Patrick O'Keefe's book has been analyzed and conserved by the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover. It will be made available for online access as a digital flipbook, accompanied by an online guide based upon a detailed study of its makeup and contents. Several of the poetic and prose pieces in the manuscript deserve addition. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and, like me, stand in wonder at the value of this South Shore treasure, which will soon be accessible as a witness to early 19th century Irish literary and personal history. Thank you so very much.